Thank you all very much. Before I begin, I want to extend sincere gratitude to the Rumi Forum for inviting me to participate. There's a great deal of questions that have been asked both yesterday and today about the Gulen movement and dialogue, and the sincerity of dialogue, what dialogue means. I don't know how many of you have read my book or read previous work yet, but by inviting me to participate on this roundtable, that is the definition of dialogue as it was defined this morning by Professor Simons, I believe. My work on the Gulen movement is not from the perspective of an admirer or a supporter. I'm not a Turkish citizen. I'm not a Muslim. That said, I'm not a political critic either. I am not emotionally invested in the success or failure of the Gulen movement. I'm not here as an advisor. I'm not to tell you what you should do in order to avoid criticism. That is not my role. I perceive my role as a social scientist. I'm an analyst. How successful I do that is up to you, the reviewer of my work. That said, my research is based upon approximately 2 years of ethnographic participant observation, both in Turkey and the United States. For about 1.5 years, I lived in Turkey. For several years before that, I learned Turkish. It's gotten worse over the years, unfortunately, but it's not too bad, I don't think. I understand more than I speak. But I come from the perspective of viewing the Gulen movement and of approaching the Gulen movement from the perspective of social movements, from the perspective of critical theory in Western social science. I am criticized by my colleagues and friends in the Gulen movement for applying categories from Western social science to explain the mobilization of a Muslim social community. Guilty as charged, yes. I do use the language and the vocabulary of Western social science. I draw upon Max Weber and Antonio Gramsci a lot in the book to make the arguments that I make about my interpretation of Fethullah Gulen as a charismatic leader and about my understanding of what education does in society, in addition to just educating children. It also creates a narrative. It creates a narrative of a national identity. And the Gulen movement's active role in education, for all of its successes in math and science, it also is in competition with other groups that are also trying to create a Turkish narrative. And in that regard, I am a political sociologist. I'm studying power. And power not defined as a big bad word. Power is defined as organizational mobilization and influence. And this social movement, or collective mobilization more specifically, is, among many other things, accumulating influence and power in Turkey and increasingly more throughout the world. Your politics are going to define whether or not you think that's a good or a bad thing, or whether you support or don't support that. Most people we've listened to the past 2 days, and most people I've listened to, this is now the 12th of these conferences I've gone to since 2005. At these conferences, sponsored by organizations like the Rumi Forum, produce papers, both by Turkish sympathizers and by who I call in the book recruited sympathizers in American and European and Australian academia, and then increasingly more from other places around the world. These conferences tend to produce a certain literature that has a certain narrative of the Gulen movement. That said, I've also observed these conferences change over time. These conferences are critiqued by people who have a different political perspective in Turkey of the Gulen movement as being promotional conferences of a narrative to sort of promote the Gulen movement as equivalent to Turkey, which it's not. It's an aspect of Turkey. And there is a number of other narratives about Turkey that compete with the Gulen movement. Now, again, by having a paper yesterday that went through a peer review process and that was nonetheless included to discuss the ways in which the Gulen movement's notion of dialogue actually reinforces the boundaries of othering other people when dialogue is so more often than not restricted towards monotheistic faith communities. For instance, in addition to the critique that was offered yesterday in the panel that made that comment. I think two different people referred to that in that way. There's also no dialogue that I've ever seen in the Gulen community with atheist communities, with agnostic communities, with New Age communities, with LGBTQ communities. Moreover, right now, there's a dozen or so fellows out in the front. I don't know if you've seen them. They're holding up Turkish flags of a variety of sorts and giving a particular political narrative of what's going on in Turkey. I would define dialogue as inviting those people in here, canceling the rest of the day, putting them up here, and having a Q&A about what's going on in Turkey. That's what I would say would be dialogue. Those who are critical of the Gulen movement are not a marginal few in Turkey. The Gulen movement is as praised and supported as it is critiqued and feared. And that is something that needs to be engaged with, I think, from the perspective of social science, perspective of an analysis, in order to understand what is the Gulen movement in addition to its own promotion of itself. And I think that knowledge is found not only in the discourse of those who are promoting their own identity, but those who are critiquing that identity as they promote their own too. And knowledge is found somewhere in the middle, and that is in fact how I would define dialogue. So I have a number of slides that I'm not going to show, because I instead wanted to say all that. But there's another, there is a lot of questions that have been asked over the past two days about who and what the Gulen movement is. When do you know you're seeing the Gulen movement or not? What is and what is not the Gulen movement? It's an ambiguous, it's a non-transparent organizational model. And this confuses people as much as someone who's been studying Turkish politics for over 10 years makes perfect sense to me why the Gulen movement maintains what I call strategic ambiguity as an organizational model. So in that regard, I will, did I just do it? Whoops. So I'm going to skip through all these and get quickly to forget all that, it's all in the book. But I will say, because I only have 10 minutes, my apologies, but I will say this. Organizing, in sociology of organizations, there's a large body of literature on the role of strategic ambiguity. What is the point and what is the organizational premise? Why would a collective organization, in whatever capacity, for-profit, not-for-profit, social movement or not, why would you organize ambiguously? And the literature suggests that there are 4 reasons why a strategically ambiguous organizational model has effect. 1, it allows you to promote a unified diversity. We are all inspired by the teachings of Fethullah Gulen, but we are not connected to the Gulen movement. This is a common discussion. This is a common thing that's expressed. Half of this room right now is affiliated with the Gulen movement in some way, and the other half is not. Maybe a little more than half is affiliated in some way. The other half is not. Most of you know what I'm talking about, right? There is no organic connection between these institutions. This is a common refrain that happens throughout the network. That is a unified diversity. We are united by being aligned with the teachings of Fethullah Gulen. We admire Fethullah Gulen. We, however, have no organic institution. We are autonomous institutions where the left hand does not know what the right is doing at any one time. You then have the ability, which was an argument made yesterday in another panel, to have a flexible accumulation model comparative to a number of 21st century organizational models. You can adapt to local particularity. When you're not a hierarchically organized structure, vertically integrated structure, you can adapt. You can respond. You can be more vocal about your relationship to the Gulen movement in the Balkans than you would be, for instance, if you're a charter school in the United States, whereby that might come with other baggage you don't want to deal with right now or you don't know how to deal with right now. Plausible deniability, then, is lended to that. You can plausibly deny that a particular organization is not directly affiliated to the Gulen movement because it is an autonomous institution. That is not a lie. This organization could cease to exist and have nothing to do with the Gulen movement, and that is a plausible, deniable argument. It then also allows you to preserve privilege, and this happens first and foremost, which is where I'll conclude with, where success and rewards happen within the Gulen movement. In my interpretation of understanding organizations, the Gulen movement is not a cult. It is not involved in brainwashing. It is not involved in making people drink the Kool-Aid of any form. It does, however, have a particular narrative and have a particular organizational structure that does have reward for participation. And the more you participate, the more reward there is, and the more you will move through the network. So I view the organization this way. This thing's very slow. This is how I view the Gulen movement. Many people in this room I would refer to as being part of that black center circle, the Jamaat, the central community. These tend to be folks who are the most inspired by Hoja Effendi Fethullah Gulen. These are the people who deeply admire his teachings and who have spent their lives, their professional lives, to promote the teachings of Fethullah Gulen in some capacity or another, usually through teaching in some capacity, and then after teaching, maybe going to work as an editor or as a journalist in some other institution as you move up the network. This is also where students are recruited, and when they're more promising, they're brought in through what's called the Abi Network of Authority into the center Jamaat. That said, outside the center of the Jamaat are the friends, Arkadaşlar, or as Said Nursi called Dost. These are the friends. These are people who are likely going to donate money to the movement, who sympathize with the movement, who like what it's doing. You then have a less defined group of sympathizers. These are both in Turkey and abroad. People are recruited specifically for their influence in academia, journalism, politics, appointed officials, religious communities, who sympathize with the group, who like the conflict resolution narrative of Fethullah Gulen, who want to promote the Gulen movement schools, the Gulen movement in Africa or in Iraq, etc. I think, however, and I'll stop here because I'm over time, that the most powerful and important organizational strata of the Gulen movement is the unaware consumer. The student at the school who has no idea that this is connected to any religious community. The consumer of products, of a book or a financial product or a piece of news because it's in English and there's only 2 options if you're reading about Turkey and you have no idea what the Gulen movement is. And that is A, the biggest, and B, the most important, in my opinion, for the continual adaptability and mobilization of this organization. And that I have to stop. I'm over a minute. Sorry about that.